Civilization and society rests on morals. Morals rest on religion. Religion rests on the Bible and faith in God and in Jesus Christ. The Bible doesn't condemn any man because of his wealth. The Bible says the man that don't provide for his family is worse than an infidel. No. According to our standard of gold and silver, Abraham was worth $1.5 billion. David was worth $3 billion. Solomon was worth $5 billion. Solomon could have hired Andrew Carnegie for a butler, J. Pierpont Morgan to cut his lawn, and Andrew Mellon for a chauffeur, and John D. to black his boots. America needs a tidal wave of the old-time religion. America needs to be taken down to God's bathhouse and the hose turned on her. And the time isn't far distant when the wheels of God's judgment are going to go sweeping through this old God-hating world. And I want to take a pledge in this audience to join me in a pledge that you will never rest until this old God-hating, Christ-hating, whiskey-soaked, Sabbath-breaking, blaspheming, infidel, bootlegging old world is bound to the cross of Jesus Christ by the golden chains of love.
Welcome back to the Church History Podcast. I'm your host, Laura Lee Siemens. Spring is in the air, so I'm already thinking about summer. And each summer, I do a series on the story behind our hymns. So if you have a hymn you would like me to cover, message me and let me know, because I'm putting a list together in the next few weeks. In our last episode, we discussed the preacher, Billy Sunday, who you heard at the beginning of this episode. I recommend listening to that episode in order to understand today's episode, because today we're discussing how the Prohibition got started, and Billy Sunday was a huge part of it. Now, I wanted to do separate episodes on the Prohibition because, well, it's a complicated story. Now, I know that there's a lot of homeschooling families who listen to this podcast, as well as families who listen in the car while they're driving. And since this story is about things that did happen in the saloons in the 1800s and early 1900s, there's really no way to tell the story without talking about why the church wanted the saloons to be outlawed. So I would recommend listening to this as a parent before listening to your child, just to make sure they're old enough to understand the story. In our episode about Billy Sunday, I talked about the world Billy was preaching in. He would hold great evangelical meetings, and hundreds and even thousands of people would walk down the sawdust trail to give their lives to Christ. Those who did often promised not to drink or to visit the saloons. Because of this, saloons would go out of business after Billy Sunday came through town. What was it about the saloons and the drinking that made Billy Sunday preach against them? First, you have to understand that drinking in the 1800s was much different than it is today. In the 1830s, basically every man drank alcohol, and the average amount was around 7 gallons of alcohol a year. That is 3 times the amount the regular drinker consumes today. This huge drinking problem was devastating for families. There was a lot of abuse towards women and children. That's why it was women who worked so hard to close the saloons. They were the ones who were being beaten, and it was their children who were also the ones being beaten. And they didn't want their sons to grow up and be the man at the bar, or their daughters to grow up and be in the same marriage they were in. There was also a great problem with poverty, and the saloons contributed to much of that. Fathers would go to the saloons before, during, and after work, and there was little money left for the family. During this time, a lot changed in the country very quickly. First, there was the Civil War from 1861 until 1865. That led to approximately 620,000 deaths. When the Civil War ended, everyone lost someone they cared about, and the country had almost fallen apart. And as the war ended, there was still much friction between the North and the South, and between the Republicans who had fought to end slavery and the Democrats. Before the Civil War, there had been a movement to end slavery. This movement was known as the abolitionist movement. It was organized by Christians, and it was Christian women in America who spread the message. Now, this wasn't just an American movement. It was an even stronger movement in England, and we talked about the English abolitionist movement in our episodes on the life of William Wilberforce. You should go back and listen to those. Now, once the Civil War ended, the American abolitionist group was looking for a new cause, and a lot of them became part of the Temperance movement. And the women in the abolitionist movement were a really big part of this. We're going to do episodes on the women's liberation movement later, but this is when women were really working to get the vote. And at the same time, now, not all women were involved in all three movements, but many women were in all three movements: the end of slavery, the right of women to vote, and the closing of the saloons. Now, beyond the Civil War, there was also other major changes. Cities were growing, and people were leaving farm life and going to the city, hoping to find riches. But what they found was a drunk workforce, people compressed into dense urban centers, and poverty. People began to fear that the country their grandfathers had built and their fathers had died for would simply self-destruct. The three major changes in this period of time were industrialization, mass immigration, and the decline of Christian values. Many people saw all three negative things were growing in the saloons. The women's group used theater and storytelling to spread their message. The plays would be shown often in churches, and in the plays, the saloon keepers were the villains. They were greedy and a tempter, trying to destroy the family. The family was the victim. The father would try to do what's right, but after drinking, he would yell at his family, who were hungry and cold, because he used his family's money to buy alcohol. The most popular play was called 10 Nights in a Barroom, and it was written by T.S. Arthur in the year 1854. Now, there's two women you have to know about in order to understand this movement. The first one is Frances Willard. In the year 1873, the Women's Christian Temperance Union was founded in Ohio. And one day, Frances Willard came to the meeting. Who was Frances Willard? Well, Frances was born on a farm in 1939. Her mother named her after her favorite author, Frances Burney. She had 3 siblings, although one died before she was born. Frances' mother was very educated, and she was the local school teacher. The family converted to Methodists when Frances was a young teenager. Frances and her sister could attend a female college and get a degree. Her brother went to a biblical institute to study to be a pastor. When Frances graduated from college, she was hired to teach. She loved college life, and she embraced her teaching career. She took different positions teaching all across America. She was passionate and committed to advancing women's education. One of the most important places she worked was the Pittsburgh Female College, and here she worked hard to develop young women. She also served in the very prestigious Wesley Seminary in New York. During her time here, she played a really important role in shaping an academic environment with a culture of learning. Then, in 1871, Frances was elected president of Evanston College for Ladies. This was a very prestigious position, and it was a significant milestone in her career. People could see that she had great leadership ability and that she was dedicated to women's education. But it was during this time, while she worked as the president of this school, that she came into conflict with a man named Charles Henry Fowler. Now, Charles and Frances had dated and even been engaged, but Frances broke off the engagement and Charles took out his anger on her. And then he worked hard to get her fired from her job. There was all this tension and all this disagreements, and eventually Frances had to resign. At the time, she was working as a dean of women at the Women's College of Northwestern University, and that happened in 1874. And that was when Frances attended a meeting at the Christian Temperance Union. She joined the movement, and 6 years later, she was voted president of the union. Frances gave this movement a vision and a clear path to victory. Her message was this: temperance was the only way for women to be safe or for women to find civil rights. She gave speeches, and many people came to hear her speak. And now I will read a small portion of one of her speeches. From the rum shops every year in America, 60,000 of our citizens reel into eternity and taste a drunkard's death. There are 500,000 steady drinkers behind this, 1 million moderate drinkers, and behind them, 2 million occasional drinkers. Behind them, all the little boys go tramp, tramp, tramp to a drunkard's tomb. And remember, these unfurling ranks, for they are always full, you know, must be recruited from somebody's cradle, from somebody's fireside, perhaps your own, no matter how stately or proud that home may be. Some ladies say to me, in all sobriety, "I wish the best in the world for your grand cause. I hope it will succeed, but then I have no boys." Perhaps you have daughters. And if you have not, somebody has, and somebody has boys. If you have daughters and not sons, try to fathom the unfathomable lesson in these words: a drunkard's wife. There's a war about this in America, a war of mothers and daughters, sisters and wives. Frances published the Home Protection Manual, and this became a very popular book that Christian women read and then passed on to others. Frances taught that for women to be free, they needed to have the right to vote so that they could vote to make alcohol illegal. During the Chicago World Fair, Frances was one of the most popular speakers, and you'll remember from our episode on the life of D.L. Moody, he was the most popular speaker at the fair. But the same crowd that went out to hear D.L. Moody speak came to hear Frances speak. Frances is a very important woman in the story of Christian women fighting to close the saloons. But the second woman you have to know about was basically the exact opposite of Frances. While Frances spoke in churches and was well-spoken and used her speeches to persuade people, the second woman you should know about was just the opposite of that. Carrie Nation had served as a nurse during the Civil War, and that's when she met and fell in love with an army doctor. After the war, they married, but the happy life Carrie had imagined was shattered. The young doctor had a drinking problem, and because of this, the marriage was difficult, and the young doctor drank himself to death and left Carrie a very young widow. She married again, and although her second husband didn't drink as much as her first, he did drink, and they often fought about his drinking. Carrie felt the only way to save others from her miserable life was to close the saloons. She prayed and asked God what she could do to close the saloons. And she had a dream. And in that dream, God told her to go outside, pick up a rock, and throw it at a saloon in a town called Kiowa. In the morning, Carrie went outside, picked up a bucket of rocks, and then traveled 25 miles to this town, where she threw rocks at the saloon. She broke the windows. Then she went into all 3 of the town saloons, which, by the way, was a place women were not allowed to go, threw rocks at the mirrors and the shelves filled with alcohol. People were so angry, and they said this was not an act of God. God would never tell her to do this, and she was chased out of town. But the very next day, a tornado came through town and finished off the saloons. Other women started to join her, and they caused a lot of problems for the saloons. Her husband was so angry at her, and when she refused to stop going town to town smashing saloons with rocks, he left her. And as he was leaving, he yelled at her, "Why don't you just go ahead and use a hatchet? That would do more damage anyway." Now a single woman with no husband, Carrie took that advice and started attacking saloons with a hatchet. She would not just hit any saloon, though. She would find the saloons that the state senators liked to go to, the favorite saloons of the state senators. And then she would attack it with a hatchet. It became known as the hatchet job. She was arrested more than 30 times in her life. A man we need to know about when it comes to the Prohibition movement was a man named Wayne Bidwell. When Wayne was a young child living on a farmhand who had been drinking chopped little Wayne's leg with a hay fork. While Wayne didn't lose his leg, he did limp after this accident and was very traumatized by the incident. Wayne knew that alcohol was the reason he could not walk properly. Wayne ran a group called the Anti-Saloon League, and he wanted to make sure no other little boys faced what he had to face. Of course, Billy Sunday was the preacher who was the most vocal about the end of the saloons and a call for a dry America. And we covered his story in our last episode. But why did so many people hate the saloons so much? Was it just the drinking? Well, the drinking was, of course, a real problem. But the saloons were the first thing opened up in town. Men would go to the saloons early before work for a drink that they called the eye opener, or some people called it the corpse survivor. They would go from the saloon to the factory, often arriving late and drunk. Then on the lunch break, they would return to the saloon, where they would receive a free bowl of soup if they bought alcohol. So they would go there for lunch. Once their shift at the factory was over, they returned to the saloon before heading home. So yes, drinking was a huge problem, but it was not the only problem. There was also prostitution. The saloons would often have an upstairs with bedrooms, and women would just live upstairs and work at the saloon as prostitutes. These were the only women allowed in the saloons, so men had no concerns about their wives knowing what they were doing, or even a friend of their wives seeing them and knowing what they were doing. There was also a lot of gambling and fighting. In fact, in Billy Sunday's sermons, he called the saloons Satan's recruiting office because of the amount of prostitution, gambling, and fighting that went on in the saloons. People didn't like the saloons for two other important reasons: immigration and politics. First, let's start with immigration. What could the saloons have to do with immigration? In 1880, the United States had around 60 million people, but by 1910, the population was 90 million. And that was not due to lots of children being born. It was due to the massive immigration that occurred during those 30 years. The country grew by 50% in just 30 years. That was too much, too quickly, for a nation that already had so many changes. Most of these immigrants were from Europe, specifically Ireland and Germany. Many Jewish people and Catholics came to America during this time, and the Protestant Church saw this as a huge problem. While America did not have a national religion at that time, it was founded on Protestant values and had mostly Protestant churches. In our earlier episodes, we discussed how many countries were Catholic or Protestant, and when one country moved from being either Catholic to Protestant or from Protestant to Catholic, it usually brought bloodshed. So seeing so many Catholics coming en masse was concerning to people during this time. And unfortunately, throughout church history, there's been many periods when the church treated Jewish people very poorly, and this was one of those time periods. People didn't want Jewish people or Catholics. And as these families arrived in droves through Ellis Island, they were looking for something familiar. In 1897, 900,000 immigrants came to New York alone. and New York wasn't the only large city to grow overnight. In 1870, Chicago had 300,000 people, and by the year 1900, the population had grown to 1.7 million. Now, America is a capitalist country, and men saw ways to make money from these families. Soon there were streets lined with saloons. There would be a German saloon, an Irish saloon, a Polish saloon, a Hungary saloon. And inside the saloon, the immigrants would find saloon owners who spoke their language. They would smell familiar smells of food from their homeland. There would be women from their homeland who lived and worked upstairs. And most of all, they would find other immigrants from their homeland. They didn't have to speak English here. They could speak the language they grew up with. The Americans suddenly found that there were so many people living in their country who didn't speak their language, didn't have the same values, and were sitting in saloons talking in a language that the Americans did not understand. So they didn't know what they were saying, and they found this concerning. Saloons also became a place for political movements. And at this time, unions were starting to grow, and they went to saloons to recruit. Political movements from Europe were also trying to grow inside of the saloons of the European countries. The saloons became known as national headquarters. If you were German and you wanted information about anything, you would go to the German saloon, and the saloon owner would be the one to help you out in your own language. And this was a problem. The saloon owners were not elected officials, but yet they were becoming the ones who had control. So there was alcohol, gambling, prostitution, immigrant gatherings, political movements. These were all the reasons that Americans were feeling the saloons were the enemy of the nation. Remember, to put this in context, this is when the Civil War was really just a memory from a short time ago, and the people understood that the nation could easily end up in another civil war. Also, Europe had many issues and was about to break out into a giant world war. World War I was brewing, so it was not unreasonable that people were concerned about what was happening in the saloons. During this time of heavy drinking, men were also working in factories, and this obviously was an issue. Imagine a factory where the machines don't have the modern safety measures, and the men working there come after drinking and then go and drink more on their break. Obviously, there were accidents. At the time, the President of America was Theodore Roosevelt, and a man named Sinclair wrote a book called The Jungle. The book's point was to convince President Roosevelt to outlaw drinking when working in a factory. And in the book, he told the story of a worker who passed out drunk, fell into a vat of lard, and was just melted into the lard. And his body was not removed. It simply dissolved into the lard. The lard was then packaged up and sold. When families read this story, they were horrified, learning that the lard they had bought and eaten may have included human flesh. Now, they hoped this story would force Roosevelt to pass a law making it illegal to drink while working at the factory. However, instead, he passed food and safety laws, making it illegal to knowingly let a body dissolve into lard and then package it up and sell it. During this time, Henry Ford opened a factory. In 1896, he began working on his first vehicle. It was the early start of the automobile. Henry Ford saw that drinking on the job was a problem, so he would fire any worker who came to work after drinking or who went to the saloon to drink on the lunch break. He had a zero tolerance for drinking. Seeing the success of the Ford factories, other factory owners began to have the same rules. This had the bonus of also stopping their workers from meeting with union workers who had a lot of influence in the saloons. In 1913, there was a big political change, the 16th Amendment. This gave the government the right to collect taxes for alcohol. This meant that the drinks were now more expensive, but that didn't help the families who were struggling financially because the father of the home was spending his money at the saloons. But it did mean that the government made a lot more money. The government then brought in income tax, taking even more money away from families. The next big political move was the Kenyan Act, and this made it a crime to bring alcohol from one state to another state. The Anti-Saloon League invested a lot of money into the 1916 election, and a lot of its candidates were elected. Then something happened that changed everything. Europe officially erupted into war, and America tried to stay out of it. It was none of their business, and they didn't care. Their only concern was the saloons, with different countries in Europe each having their own saloons all down a single street in their town. What kind of politics were they spreading? And would they bring the European war to America? But then something changed everything. A passenger boat left from New York Harbor, traveling full of passengers on vacation. The boat was fired on and sank. The boat had 1,198 passengers and crew members. It sank in just 18 minutes, and every single one of them died. On board were 128 Americans. And since the boat had left from New York Harbor, Americans now felt as if they had been personally attacked. American patriotism exploded overnight, and with that patriotism came more anger towards Europeans and specifically European saloons. Beer was suddenly seen as a German drink, and no one wanted to be seen drinking German beer. It was simply unpatriotic. Schools stopped all German language classes, and hotels and saloons changed their names to drop anything that sounded German. The Chicago Bismarck Hotel became the Randolph Hotel. Restaurants that served sauerkraut started serving what they called Liberty cabbage. The unrest continued to grow for the next 2 years. Then, in April 1917, America officially joined World War I. The day the news broke that America had joined the war, Billy Sunday was preaching in New York City. He stayed and preached every night for weeks, and it was the most attended meeting of his ministry. World War I ended at 11 o'clock on November 11, 1918. We're going to talk more about that in future episodes. It was a 4-year war, with America involved for just 1 year. About 40 million people died in that war, including civilians. 117,466 Americans were killed, and over 204,000 were wounded in just 1 year that they were involved. A year after World War I ended, on January 16, 1919, Nebraska became the 38th state to vote in favor of a new amendment to the Constitution, and officially, the 18th Amendment was passed, banning alcohol. This was the first time that there was an amendment that took rights away from citizens instead of giving them rights. The law gave people 1 year to prepare. Imagine, it's January 1920. You're dressed warm on this freezing day, but you're outside marching in a parade. At the head of the parade is the famous preacher, Billy Sunday. He leads the parade while everyone sings and cheers. The parade is a stunning sight. Pallbearers are carrying a coffin, and behind the coffin is a man dressed as the devil. He is marching sadly behind the coffin while everyone else is cheering. Someone asks, "Whose funeral is this?" You shout back, "It's John Barleycorn, my dear friend. We're finally rid of alcohol." Why is his coffin huge? It's 20 feet long. You laugh at that person asking those silly questions. Why does it have to be so long? Inside are all the problems Barleycorn brought us. The sinful activities of the saloon, the gambling, the prostitution, the broken families, all gone. The crowd is singing as they march. The men in the crowd are digging a hole. The coffin full of alcohol is buried while Billy Sunday leads the crowd in praising God. But how is society going to react to this change? And will things get any better? In our next episode, we'll tell part 2 on the story of Prohibition. If you enjoyed this episode and want to hear more, visit my website at lauraleesiemens.com, and I'll see you next time.